Well, hey, we're kicking off a new series this week. It's an exciting one of that, and it kind of talks about one of our core values. So we have some values here at our church. One is the value of health. We like to think that this is a place that you would find some emotional health, certainly some spiritual health, mental health, and that a full life, an abundant life, looks like a life full of health. The Bible might refer to that as shalom. The other value we have is humility. One of the things that we value here is not making a big deal about ourselves, but instead realizing that Jesus is that big deal. And the other one is empowerment. Because one of the things that we believe is that God has plans on changing the world through you. That's what we believe. It's in the Bible in a few places. But the problem is that most of us are just trying to get our kids to eat vegetables, and ending world hunger seems like a bit of a stretch, right? We are navigating lives that are complicated. We have schedules, we have situations, we have all sorts of things. Things in our house break. Things always seem to get messier and messier. And yet, somehow, God's going to use us to change the world, to change others, and that's exactly what the Bible promises. And that's what this series is actually about. Courageous compassion. That for the next few weeks, what we're going to be talking about is some real and practical ways that God wants to use you to change the world around you. And I'm excited to share with you. And we're going to share one of my favorite words. I never thought I'd get to preach about it. But before we get there, let's jump in. We're going to be in Mark chapter 1, verse 40. We're going to be in the NASB today. More on that later. But here's how it goes. Now, it's Mark chapter 1, so just so you know, there's several chapters in Mark, far more than one. There's actually 16. It means it's the beginning of the movie. This is the opening scene, right? This is when you get introduced to the hero. You're going to find out what he's like, right? He beats up some local bullies, or he's stuck in a dead end job. Like you're meeting Jesus for the first time, and this is the story we get. A leper came to Jesus, beseeching him, begging him, and falling on his knees before him. Here it goes. And it continues. And saying, if you are willing, you can make me clean. What a statement. If you're willing, you can make me clean. And the reason I think he says this is real simple. Because he's been a leper probably most of his life. And most people weren't willing to help. Now, Jesus can heal him, but how many people walked right by when he's begging for money or a kind word or just to make eye contact? And so this leper has experienced a life where the entire world seems to be unwilling. And so when he sees the man of God, the promised Messiah, show up, he thinks to himself, maybe God will be willing for me. Verse 41. Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Y'all, he touched him. And he said, I am willing, be cleansed. He touched him. I don't know if you've seen leprosy. It's not a very appealing thing. Jesus touched him before hand sanitizer was invented. Jesus once healed somebody 7 miles away. Just like threw it up there. Right? Like Steph Curry, like just shot it up there, wind carried it, boom, landed right on the guy, the kid was healed. And Jesus touched him. Jesus could have healed him from 30 feet away. But he closes the ground, walks right up to him, and here's the word, he cleanses him. That's huge. Leprosy is a disease, but socially, it meant to be unclean. He was an untouchable. If you would have touched a leper back then, you had to go through a purity process. Now, before we think that's too mean, it's just kind of practical. Because leprosy is somewhat contagious and somewhat genetic. And if you have the genes for it, you can contract it. And so here's the deal. If you come in contact with somebody, we don't know that you might have the disease, and so you kind of get separated for a second. But now this group had gone out of that practical space of, hey, we need to keep people quarantined, to a very disrespected space where people overlooked him. He was unclean. You can imagine how it would have felt. And then all of a sudden, the Messiah himself crosses the distance between him and the leper, and he gives him a hug. He touches him before he heals him. In verse 42, you know what's coming. Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. It worked. It's amazing. And then Jesus sternly warns him and immediately sent him away. And what Jesus said, well, he said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest. Now this was the law back then, that when people got miraculously healed of a disease, they would go to the priest who was taught how to make sure that the disease has actually left the person. Because you can imagine why people might fake it. Put some mud on it, try to hide it, right? It's the plot. I mean, it's in almost every zombie movie. They hide that they got bit. Same thing. And so you need to go and follow the rules and don't tell anybody. There's a practical side. If word gets out that Jesus is touching lepers, then Jesus is going to get put on the unclean list. If that happens, Jesus is going to get a reputation not as a good rabbi, but as unclean. In other words, when Jesus touches this man, Jesus is risking being judged by others. So he's already said, Jesus already did the uncomfortable thing of touching somebody who has leprosy. He's doing the uncomfortable thing. He's being judged for it as well. But of course, the guy does what we all would do, right? First and second rules of Fight Club. That's right, you talk about it. That's what he does. But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and spread the news around. In other words, he's dancing. I'm healed. I'm cleansed. Everybody look, Jesus Christ healed me. He touched me. He cleansed me. Oh, the word gets out. And Jesus' life gets messy. To such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city. Not just the city, any city. In other words, if Jesus just wants to pop in to swing by Target, he can't do that without people thronging him. Jesus used to have a really clean life, right? He used to sleep in a little bit. He'd wake up, he'd go to the coffee shop, have a little quiet time, drink some coffee, right? Teach some people at lunchtime, maybe hit the gym afterwards, pick the disciples up from fishing, get them to soccer practice, get them home, feed them a meal, get them in bed, watch Ted Lasso. Of course, Jesus watched Ted Lasso. Of course. And get a good night's sleep. That was Jesus' life. It wasn't messy. It was neat. It was together. It always looked like the maid had just left. But now things have hit, like it's out of control. He can't even publicly enter the city. It continues, but he had to stay out in the unpopulated areas. And they were coming to him from everywhere. It wasn't DoorDash. He had to stay in Henley. And they weren't bringing him food. They were bringing him sick people. It got messy. Jesus has this compassion. And he gets uncomfortable. He has to touch somebody. He has this compassion, and all of a sudden, he gets judged. If you know, several of the times the Pharisees judged Jesus for touching unclean people. He has this compassion and things get messy, and then people take advantage of him. Think about that. Jesus healed you. He asked you to do one thing, and you took advantage of him. More people showed up to get healed by Jesus than to listen to Jesus. And when Jesus hung on the cross, they abandoned him. And his compassion brought him to that point. And having compassion on people was no easy task for Jesus. It got messy. It got icky. He got judged. People took advantage of him. But he still did it, and he did it gladly. And here's why. One word. One simple word. Splanchnon. Rolls right off the tongue. Let's just walk through how to pronounce it. Splanchnon. Splanchnon. Say it. We're going to be talking about this for the next 3 weeks, maybe beyond that. It's a wonderful word. It means guts. Literally, the word means guts. Now, what happened in the ancient world, which you may not know, or maybe you remember, we talked about before, the seat of emotion where you felt things like love, and where you felt things like joy, and we felt things like fear and anxiety and worry, that didn't happen in the heart, that happened in the guts. You know what I'm talking about, right? We're talking about getting butterflies. We're talking about that gut feeling. Yeah, that's it. And what Splanchnon meant was this idea that out of your guts, you felt compassion or love or pity. Here it is. It's in Mark chapter 1, verse 41. Bring it back. Moved with Splanchnon. Splanchnismai is actually what it means. It's the verb version. So moved with gut-wrenching mercy or love, moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I'm willing. Not out of, oh, this would be the right thing to do, but his splanchnon exploded, and he had to reach out and touch a man who's never been touched before, or at least not in decades. And that's what splanchnon is. Splanchnon is a gut-level love resulting in mercy and in action. That's what it is. It's this thing you feel that you just have to do something. It's what Sarah McLachlan is trying to get you to do with puppies. Okay? She's trying to get your splanchnon going. It's what happens when your child comes home with a broken heart, and now you're about to bend all of reality to make it right. That's splanchnon. When your friend shares their deepest hurt, and you stand up across that table, you march right over there, and you hug them. It's because of splanchnon. It's what God felt when he sent Jesus. This is Luke chapter 1, verse 78. Because of the tender mercy, or because of the splanchnon of God, he, with which the sunrise from on high will visit us, which is Jesus, it's poetry. But because of the splanchnon, when the prodigal son is coming home and the father sees him, you know what the father feels? Say it. He feels splanchnon. This gut-level love that's resulting in mercy and action. And the reason the father runs is because he has splanchnon. It's what Jesus felt when he saw the masses, Matthew chapter 9. Seeing the people, he felt splanchnon for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. They felt splanchnon. It's a beautiful, beautiful word. And it's what Jesus felt when this leper comes walking up and says, if you're willing, to touch me, just to be healed. But the splanchnon said, hey, I had to touch him. It's love at work. And we talk a lot about God's love in this church because we think that God is loving, and we think that all we're seeking, honestly, the way that we were built and made by God, is to find and seek after love. And that so much of what we do when we get off track, this thing called sin, is seeking God's love, not in God's way. And that when we come back to God's love, it's what transforms us and changes us. We talk a lot about that. Love is the critical ingredient, though, in change. And I firmly believe this, that you cannot change what you do not love. That if you don't love something, you actually won't be able to change it. You'll end up destroying it. And here's what here let me explain where I'm coming from on that. One is to see something change, you want to see the good for it. Like if there's something going on and you just don't value that thing, then you don't care to change it. If you care to change it, well, then you want to see something good about it. But you also want it to continue. It takes those two things. I want what's good for you, and I want you to continue to exist. Or maybe reverse it. You cannot hate something or someone into change. This is the secret. You can't hate someone or something into change. I firmly believe that if you want to get on some sort of weight loss journey, what you need to do is you need to go shopping and you need to go get a haircut and you need to feel good about yourself, because when you start loving yourself again, you'll start wanting to change yourself in a positive way. I think this is why politics right now is so ineffective. Because this wedge politics pushes us away from this loving connection with somebody else, and instead we're at each other. And since we don't love the other person, we just want to see them go away. You can't hate something or something into change. There are plenty of pious Jews. There are plenty of Jews, the Pharisees at the time, who wanted to see sinners be changed. They hated them, though, so there was no change. There are plenty of people who wanted to see leprosy go away, but they didn't love lepers, so nothing changed. But then Jesus enters the picture, and he loves sinners, and sinners change. He loves the lepers, and leprosy leaves. It's the same reason that you can't change poverty simply by hating poverty. That's where communism comes in. Poverty is the problem. We hate poverty. We'll destroy poverty. But that's not what communism ended up doing. If you want to destroy poverty, if you want to get rid of poverty, then you have to love the poor. Splanchnon. It takes that splanchnon to change the world. But we can't change our world or our neighbors or even our own lives without love. And the big idea today is this: if you want to make an impact in the world and in the lives of others, you have to have splanchnon. That's what it's going to take. Else it's just good intentions on the side. Else it's extracurricular. I should do a little bit extra this week. I want to be a little generous. Yeah, I'll give a little bit for the SPCA, or I'll give a little bit for the... It's not really, though, in my guts. It's not this compassion or love motivating me to action. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to have splanchnon, it's going to take courage. Because it's not easy to touch a leper. It's going to take courage because it's not easy to wade into messy situations for other people's good. It's going to take courage for us to have splanchnon. John says it this way in 1 John chapter 3, verse 17. But whoever has the world's goods, in other words, who's ever rich in things of this world, and sees his brother or sister in need, and closes his splanchnon against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Now, there's one way to read this to say that, hey, if you do this, that God's love, you've not experienced it. I think that's maybe possible. But I think the more accurate thing is simply this. There's a difference between experiencing God's love and having God's love abide in you. In other words, how does it live in you? Because God's love multiplies when we pour it out. That's how it works. That's how love works, right? If you just wrote somebody you love and you're crazy about them, and you just write them a love note and you're like, I love you. And they're like, that's so meaningful. And nothing else happens? Well, nothing else happens. The love's not abiding. But the more you bounce it back and forth, right? The more you get sad, I love you, no, I love you, no, I love you. Like that whole game, it's a little sickening to watch, but it definitely builds love. And when we are pouring out splanchnon, when we have splanchnon for others, we have the courage for that, then we're abiding in God's love because God is loving us as God is loving through us others. And the chances are that the love you've experienced from God came through the hands or the words or the hugs of somebody else. And if we are going to be people of splanchnon, it's going to take courage. We need courage for a few things. I want to walk you through them. I think the first one is this. You have to have the courage to be uncomfortable. Jesus touched a leper. There's no antibiotics at the time. No one's changing his wounds. It was messy. It was uncomfortable. And it's uncomfortable to invite a foster kid into your home. It's uncomfortable to talk with someone about their addiction. It's uncomfortable to go without air conditioning or a washing machine on a mission trip. Splanchnon is often going to lead us to uncomfortable places. And I think that's why oftentimes we want to kind of push away, or why we're more comfortable when Sarah McLachlan's playing her song to just send some money. Because we send money for all sorts of weird things. So yeah, we'll send a little bit of money there, but it doesn't get too uncomfortable. But if you've ever experienced true compassion from somebody, you knew that they had to cross a line of comfort. And for most of us, it's the inertia of our comfortable lives that is keeping us from making a difference. It's the inertia of our comfortable lives that are keeping us from truly experiencing God. It's that inertia of this is comfortable, don't mess it up. The air conditioning is at the right level, the snacks are on point, and there's lots more shows lined up. Yeah. But that's not how you're meant to live. It becomes uncomfortable to hug a homeless mom. But that's what Splanchnon does. So we have to have the courage to be uncomfortable. We also have the courage to be judged. I think this is one that we're not often prepared for. But have you ever considered the judgment that Jesus faced? People literally got mad at Jesus for who he ate with. There was a point where Jesus gets invited to a big party, and this Pharisee's putting it on, and it's just happening, and then all of a sudden this woman of the night, you know what I mean, comes in, and she's so broken by her life, and she's so hopeful for what Jesus can do that she falls on her feet, and falls on her face, and she's crying and weeping at Jesus' feet, and Jesus is just trying to get more guacamole, and this thing is happening. And then the guy who's throwing the party is like, thinks to himself, he gets that face, right? Yeah, I don't really think to himself. And he's like, Jesus was something special. He would know who this woman is. Time out, how do you know who she is? But if Jesus would know who this woman is, and he would stop it. I don't like to be judged about things that are even true of me, much less ridiculous things. Like the company I keep, the people I love. Jesus caught flack for hanging out with the wrong people and for sticking up for the wrong people. And if we're going to have Splanchnon, it's going to take courage to speak up for the marginalized in our world. To speak up for the poor and for the immigrants, for the LGBTQ, for racism and women. Your weird neighbor down the street who smells of patchouli and mushrooms, right? But Jesus' heart goes out to the marginalized. That's what Splanchnon does. Jesus is always crossing lines to join those people on the outside. And when he does it, he shifts it. And if we're going to be people with courageous compassion, if we're going to be people of Splanchnon, we have to have the courage to be judged. To be at a dinner party and somebody walk in and go, why did you invite that person? Be sitting around with a group of people when jokes start getting passed out and go, that's clever, but it's also not kind. We have to feel that from the guts. So we have to have the courage to be uncomfortable. We have the courage to be judged. We have to also have the courage to get messy. And I know some of you guys are feeling that one. Helping is messy. Jesus had a good thing going. He'd heal some people, teach, and then he had like a nice little chill thing. And then the word got out. And Jesus literally had to shut it down. Guys, it's midnight. I can heal some more people tomorrow, but I got to go to bed. It got messy. And when we think about foster care or helping someone with their addiction or making space for someone who's just trying to get back on their feet, it gets messy. You get late night phone calls, right? You don't get to all the little errands that keep your life neat and together. And that's often why we pump the brakes, I think, is because we feel like it's going to get messy. And messy isn't the vibe we're going for. Some people in our church work with ex-cons. That's messy. It's messy to work with somebody whose survival for decades has been lying, and then to try to help them get their life back on track because you don't know what to believe. And you're constantly having to put boundaries in place, not just to protect yourself, but protect them. But Splanchnon invites us to get messy. That's part of it. And the last thing, and maybe the hardest for some of us, we have to have the courage to be taken advantage of. This is a hard one. Because none of us want to feel like a chump. We want to be respected. We want to hear thank you. But the truth is that the people who need your compassion the most often can't do that. The people whose lives I have impacted the most did not say thank you to me. The people I stood up for, defended, got ridiculed for my position on them, they never said thank you. But that's what it's about. Could you imagine if people didn't take advantage of Jesus? Right, there's actually a story where Jesus walks through a crowd of lepers and a crowd of crippled people and a crowd of broken people and goes up to one person and goes, "Hey, you've been like this for 38 years. Do you want to get healed?" And the guy has this big excuse why he hasn't been healed yet. And Jesus is like, "Time out. I didn't ask for your excuses. Do you want to be healed?" And what if the guy would have been like, "Well, Jesus, that's wonderful, but I don't want to take advantage of you." Well, what are you going to do? You can't buy healing. So I guess you're stuck there. But drowning people, if you're throwing them lifelines, they have to take advantage of it. And they're not always going to say thank you. And people aren't always going to see what you're going through. They're not going to see the load, the work, the sweat, the tears, the fear, the uncomfortableness, the judgment you're going to encounter. And that's okay. Some of us struggle to take advantage of grace. Every day, God gives you a new pile of grace to cover your mistakes, to help your heart mend itself. And for some of us, we're just trying to keep from crossing the line ever again. And Jesus is like, "I have so much grace for you crossing the line. It's not about the grace, it's about coming alive." You can only imagine not taking advantage of that. And I think that's why we're often hesitant to let other people take advantage of us, is because we have not taken advantage of God's grace. And maybe the first step for you when it comes to Splanchnon is realizing God's Splanchnon for you. Maybe the very first step is realizing God's love for you. That when God sees you, he loves you and longs to help you with your doubt, with your fear, with your guilt, with that addiction, with your depression, with the reason you wake up and the reason you can't go to sleep. That when we stand before God, we are all like the leper. We are all broken. We're all convinced there's something wrong with us. We feel like no one is willing to help us, much less touch us. We show up and we feel like we're too messy for God. And so we come to church to try to fix ourselves. And we stand here in service and we pray and we say, "God, here's this thing. Will you fix it?" Never realizing that God wants to hug you first. That before God heals you, he might just want to touch you because that's what you need. And because when we ask to be fixed, God offers a hug, we sometimes walk away. We leave before the hug, and we never get to the healing that brought us here in the first place. Here at our church, we like to give you guys like a moment to reflect, a question to think through. And today, it's no different, but I do want to give you a prayer, actually, instead of a question. That's the wrong one. Sorry, let's delete that one. I'll read it to you guys. That's my fault. God, I want to be healed, but I really need a hug. Will you surround me with love? As the band kind of comes up and prepares, if you would, just kind of hold your hands out. I'll read that again. Just pray this in your heart. God, I want to be healed, but I really need a hug. Will you surround me with your love? God, I want to be healed, but I really need a hug. Will you surround me with your love? If you would just sit in that moment for a second and just talk to God about where you want to be touched, where you need to be held. He took the bread, full of Splanchnon for his friends and for us. He broke it. And he said, "This is my body broken for all the brokenness in the world, for all the sin, for all the fear, for all the doubt, for all the addiction, for all the places you long to be fixed and you really just need to be hugged. For all the lepers who encountered the unwillingness of others." Jesus said, "This is my body broken because I am willing." And later in the meal, he takes the wine and he pours it out. And he said, "This is my blood poured out as a new promise that comes straight from the Splanchnon, that wherever there's brokenness, it'll be brought back together. The new promise that the broken finds wholeness, that sin finds forgiveness, that doubt finds acceptance, that fear finds love, and that you find your Father who has loved you your whole life. What we like to do here at Resonating, our communion table is always open to everybody. We have one down front, we have one in the back, but we like to dip it. We like to take the broken piece and we like to dip it in the promise as a reminder that the most broken parts of us are covered by the most powerful parts of God. And that is our hope. Not just our hope, that is our reality. Let's pray. Father God, I thank you so much for today and the opportunity to be with my friends. God, as we seek to have Splanchnon in this world, will you remind us of the Splanchnon you have for us? That it was your guts that brought you to earth. That it was your guts that brought you to the cross. It was your guts that rose again. And we rejoice. Having received your love, experienced your grace, we find hope in you. It's in Christ's name.